Okay, so we're going to get rolling. Welcome. We're in Jonah now. This is the first week of Jonah. And I'll tell you today is going to be some background information. You know that I like to make sure that we've got some background information to make sure we're all on the same page as we get into it. So if this is not your thing, make sure you come back next week and following, because we're going to get into the actual text. And so but I'm glad to spend this time with y'all going over some preliminary concerns when you're trying to read the book of Jonah. Amos is my boy. He's my favorite prophet. Jonah's a close second because I love this book. It's not like any other book of prophecy that you read in the Old Testament. It's unique. And there are some ways that it's unique. And so we're going to talk about some of those today. How many of you have read the book of Jonah front to back before? It's very short. Any of us? Okay, you've read it. How many of you mostly know the VeggieTales version? It's a great, Rich is being honest, yeah. It's a great version, strongly recommend it. It's highly entertaining. It's also not the version for adults. And so we're going to be reading the book of Jonah like a bunch of adults in here. And so I'm really glad to take this journey with y'all over the coming weeks, okay? So one of the questions that we need to ask out of the gate is, what in the world is the book of Jonah, okay? So that may seem like a silly question, but if you keep up at all with where scholars are at on this book, or where preachers are at with this book, or religious teachers are at with this book, there's not exactly the amount of agreement as you might like to see. So some people ask, is this a book of prophecy? Some ask, is this a book of narrative history? Talk about these. Is this a book that's a parable? Is this book a parable? And is this book fact or fiction? And we're going to try to answer some of those today. Out of the gate, any front runners? Anybody got a one up there at least that you like? Those aren't the only options, but okay, you like that it's a parable. Don't. Wow, y'all are so quick to y'all are like booming. There's like a peanut gallery in here. Man, y'all are so quick to pounce. Easy killer, okay? That's actually a thing that's out there. Some people take this as a parable. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about why they take it as a parable and how we're going to approach it, okay? So let's just start with that one. So some people take this as a parable. Why do you think some people would take this as a parable? What are some of the features of the story that would make somebody think, hey, maybe this isn't like a true story. Maybe it's like a parable. It's a made-up story meant to teach a point. Because he was in the fish for 3 days. Although, yesterday, if you were watching the news, there was literally just a guy who got swallowed by a blue whale and then spit up. Like, that literally just happened. I'm not making that up. So I'm just saying, it may not be outside of the realm of possibility just because it's not normal experience. So let me say a word about this, okay? How many of you have been to the moon? Now, there are people who believe we never went to the moon, okay? That's fine. There are people who believe that it was all staged in like a studio out in Arizona or something, right? So I get it. If you're one of those people, I get it. But many of us believe that we've been to the moon, okay? So if you believe that we've been to the moon, why do you believe that that's possible when that's not the experience of anybody in here? Right? In other words, just because something's not typical doesn't mean it's outside the realm of reality. There was a guy that literally just got swallowed by a blue whale and spit up. He's fine, okay? So just because something isn't typical doesn't mean that it's outside the realm of reality. But I get it. There are people who go 3 days in the fish, no way, and then they say, well, it must be a made-up story. It's a parable. It's a made-up story meant to prove a point, okay? How about a book of prophecy? Who is Jonah supposed to be? Is he just some schmo? He is a prophet. He's supposed to be a prophet, right? So normally, if you have a book that's named for a prophet, it's a book of Prophecy. So how many of you think it's a book of prophecy? Okay, some of us. What's the problem with that reading? If you were to take this as a book of prophecy, what problem are you going to run into? Okay, short-term prophecy. Do you have a lot of the actual prophecy that he preached in this book? So he supposedly goes to Nineveh, right? Y'all know the story. You've seen VeggieTales, right? He's supposed to go to Nineveh, which is a city in the ancient Near East. It's in modern-day Iraq, okay? So he's supposed to go there, and he's supposed to preach. Do you have the content of the sermon? Not a lot of it. You have a little bit, but not a lot. Whereas in other books of prophecy, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, do you get long copies of the sermons that these guys preached? Yeah, you get long copies of the sermons. So like Isaiah chapter 40 starts with, comfort, comfort my people, right? And you read that every year at Christmas time. Comfort, comfort my people. Say to Israel that her sins are atoned for. You get the whole sermon laid out for you. In Jonah, you don't get the whole sermon. You get like a snippet of it, and then we're left to the imagination what else he said. Okay? So that's weird. Again, I just want to point out to y'all that this is a different kind of prophecy book than any other prophecy book that you'll read in the Old Testament. And that's one of the reasons it's weird. Yeah, Joel.
Well, I'm in the right place, I didn't know all this. So, but I think about his life and the things that happened in it. I think of like Hosea, when he married someone that kind of taught a lesson, so to speak.
Yeah.
I'm saying it quickly, but their lives and the actions that took place have a story within the story.
Right.
Marrying a woman like Hosea did. And
she's a prostitute, you can just say she's a prostitute. Yeah, I know you don't want to say it in church, you know, she's. There's a saying about a prostitute in church, by the way. There's a saying about that too. Yeah, you're sweating. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. So yeah, okay. So that's a good point, though, Joel. So there's two ways that we learn from prophets. One is from their preaching. One is from their sermons, right? The other is they lived out what we call prophetic actions. Prophetic actions, and so the prophet Hosea believed that God told him to marry a prostitute in order to show the people of Israel what their relationship with God was like. It would be like this faithful guy who's always faithful to you, who's married to a prostitute, who's always trying to run back to the life and run back to the streets because she can't be happy with you. And so the prophet married a prostitute to show people this is what y'all are like with your God. So that's called a prophetic action. If you've ever wondered, why did people not arrest Jesus when he turned over the tables in the temple and he drove people out with a whip, you know? And that's pretty violent, right? Why didn't they arrest Jesus? Well, they took him to be a prophet. They took his actions to be prophetic actions. You don't arrest him in the middle of what is a lived out, acted out sermon. Okay, so that's why they did not arrest Jesus. There's a long tradition of prophetic actions. And so, yeah, that's what's different about Jonah. His life becomes a series of these actions that we learn from, right? So that's what's different about the book. It is a book of prophecy in that it's about a prophet and it's about him going to a city to prophesy, okay? Everybody with me? But it's not like any other prophetic book that you're used to reading in the Old Testament. It's okay to say it's different, but it is a book of prophecy. What about narrative history? Does anyone, like that's kind of a long-haired academic term. Does anybody know what I mean when I say narrative history? So narrative, it tells a story. And what about the history part? Something that actually happened, right? So is that the way we've typically done history in Western countries for quite some time now? Is that the way we've typically done history? In some form, but mostly we do a lot of quantifying. So we give you facts, figures, dates. We keep everything in the same chronological order that it actually happened in, that sort of thing. Everybody with me? Is that the way most world cultures have done history for most of human history? Or do you know? No, it's not. It's either spoken word like an epic poem, or they'll write it down, but they'll write it down like they're telling a story of the events. So they'll go ahead and sprinkle a little fairy dust, as it were. It doesn't mean they're making stuff up. It may mean that they move some things around, though, in order to tell the story a certain way. A great example of this is the Gospels. Did Jesus really exist? Yes, he did. We know that. We've got extra biblical evidence for the existence of Jesus of Nazareth. Did he really die? Yes, he did. We've got all the records. We know that the Romans executed him on a cross. We've got all that stuff. But if you're reading the Gospels, like John will put Jesus cleansing the temple, like turning over the tables and the whip and all that prophetic action. He puts it at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, but that really didn't happen chronologically until the last week of his life. And the other Gospels give you that chronology. Why did John do that? Well, for one, John's not from a Western country. He's from the Middle East. So don't try to make him from England, from Oxford University. He's not, okay? He's from the ancient Near East, number one. So he has a different culture than you, and he does history different. Number two, his is the last gospel to be written. So everybody already had the right chronology in order. He's trying to show you something different about Jesus' life in the way that he's trying to tell the story. And that's actually not wrong. There's actually the beginnings of a return to narrative history in Western universities today. So Western scholars in places like Europe and the United States, Canada, they're looking back at narrative ways of telling history again. So this is coming back around. You know, what goes around comes around. This is coming back around. And so a narrative history is true. It is history, but it's going to be told like a story. Okay, that's a thing. Is this book a parable? We talked about it. And is this book fact or fiction? We're going to look at it. Let's keep looking at what in the world is the book of Jonah. Somebody turn to 2 Kings, chapter 14, verses 25 through 28. And somebody volunteer to read it nice and loudly like you're reading the Word of God, because you are. Second Kings chapter 14, verses 25 through 28. Who wants to read that nice and loudly for the group? Okay, nice and loud.
He restored the border of Israel from Lebo Hamath as far as the sea of Arabia, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke by his servants. Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet, who was from Gath-Hepher, for the Lord saw that the affliction of Israel was bitter, for there was none left, bond or free, and there was none to help Israel. But the Lord had not said that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven. So he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam,
the king,
as the son of Joash.
Okay. So Kings, as in the title would tell you, is a book about the acts of the kings of ancient Israel. Everybody got me? So this is a king named Jeroboam, and he carried out something that had been prophesied by one of the prophets of Israel. What is the name of that prophet? Jonah, son of Amittai. Who's the guy that the book of Jonah is about? Jonah, the son of Amittai. So, in other words, you've got a history. This is actually, it bills itself as a history. This is a chronicle of kings and their acts, right? So these are the annals of the kings. And they've got Jonah listed. So, as I was just saying, how do different cultures record history and what is narrative history? We just talked about that a little bit. Different cultures don't necessarily record history the way that we've done it for a little while here in Western countries, like in Europe or in North America. Everybody with me? But they record it as a story. But this guy Jonah pops up in an annals of the kings of ancient Israel. And it mattered to public policy, in this case, domestic policy, okay, under the reign of King Jeroboam, that a prophet said something, because remember, prophets aren't just clerics, they're not just religious leaders in ancient Israel, it's a religious and a political office. So it matters that the prophet said something publicly about what God said should be done in the kingdom, and then the king carried it out. Everybody with me? And that guy was Jonah. So he's a prophet in the king's court. Everybody with me? So there's good, strong evidence that this is not a parable, because Jonah's a real guy. So far, so good? Okay. We got to ask ourselves, though, is Jonah fact or fiction? Now, this tendency to view Jonah as fiction is a recent development, but it is a thing. If you were to go and step onto a university campus today, or into churches in the United States and Europe today, there are church pulpits, there are synagogues that would preach Jonah as if, in both Jewish and Christian contexts, as if Jonah is somehow not true. That it's a fictional story that was made up in order to teach a point. But this tendency to view Jonah as fiction is a recent development. For the last 2,000 years, most Christian and Jewish commentators have viewed Jonah as factual. That's one of the great things about looking at Old Testament books, y'all. You get not just what Christians say about it, you get what Jewish teachers say about it. That's fun, because now we get both takes on it, the Christian and the Jewish. And both Christian and Jewish commentators have viewed Jonah as factual, like this happened. Again, you talk about the great fish, whatever that is. Is it a fish? Is it a whale? Don't know. Just because something doesn't happen very often doesn't mean that it's outside the realm of possibility. There's a guy in the news yesterday who was swallowed and spit up by a blue whale. Okay? Most commentators in Christian and Jewish circles for the last 2,000 years have viewed this book as factual, and Jesus viewed Jonah as factual history, and you can find that recorded in Matthew 12 and Luke 11, where Jesus talks about Jonah as if he's a real guy and as if what happened to him was real, and then Jesus uses that in order to comment on his own death and burial and resurrection. So Jesus says that no sign will be shown the people of Israel other than the sign of Jonah. That just as Jonah was 3 days in the belly of the fish, so Jesus will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days, he says, before he rises. So he called his shot concerning the resurrection and pointed to Jonah. And somebody might say, well, he's just referencing a fictional story, like I might say, well, just as Hamlet did X, right? Which Hamlet's a made-up guy, in case you don't know your Shakespeare, right? That's a made-up guy, okay? So someone would say, well, he just referenced a parable or a made-up fictional story like we might reference Hamlet. Well, no, you can't. You know why? Good, I'm glad you asked. I'm going to tell you why. Because he's ancient Near Eastern Jewish, that's why. In Jesus' culture at the time, no teacher ever referenced, for purposes of a typology, you don't reference in typology another event that is fictional. Because you are talking about something you intend to see happen or carried out, therefore you have to relate it to another real historical event. So that's the way ancient Jews work their typology. Are you with me? So no, he can't actually reference a story he thinks is fictional. He can only reference a story if he's talking about his own resurrection, which he intends to be an actual fact in the future. He can only reference a historical event from the past. It has to be true. So Jesus took Jonah to be a real guy, and he took what happened to him to be true. Yes?
Sidebar. Jesus talked about Lazarus and the rich man.
Yeah.
Lazarus had the swords. Is that a parable or did that actually happen?
No, that one's a parable.
Okay, because I've been told I know it was the ministry because Jesus gave the name to the woman.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it was a real incident.
Okay.
And think that blows my mind because, there's a conversation between what you tell me.
Yeah.
The story kind of didn't make sense to me. So what you were saying kind of reminded me of that because.
When Jesus gave the rich man and Lazarus as a parable, he's not relating it to anything in his own ministry. He's talking to people about their faith life. When Jesus references 3 days in the heart of the earth, he's talking about his own life, death, burial, and resurrection. So he has to relate that if he's going to give you typology from the Old Testament. He has to relate that to a real event from history. So in other words, he believed it to be real. Yeah.
What is the sign of Jonah?
The sign of Jonah, 3 days in the fish, 3 days in the heart of the earth, 3 days in the tomb. That's the sign of Jonah. Yeah, Rich?
So 2 questions. How much time elapsed between Jonah's experience and Jesus? And the second is how do we account for the fact that people knew this story about Jonah and all of his trials and tribulations and not trusting God and trying to run away? So how do they know that?
I'm going to get to your second question in a minute because we're headed that way. Your first question was how much time elapsed. So Jonah, these events took place in the mid-8th century BC. So roughly 750 years passed between Jonah and Jesus.
Like they would have forgotten about it.
Well, I mean, when you grow up going to Jewish school, you're not going to forget about it because you study these scriptures, right? I mean, yeah. But yeah, there's roughly 750 years between Jonah and Jesus. Okay? Good questions. Good comments. Let's keep talking about is Jonah fact or fiction. So here's one thing that some people say. So if you know the story, and we're going to get into the story in the coming weeks, but if you know the story, Jonah's told by God to go preach to the city of Nineveh, and they convert en masse. Like they abandon their old gods, they start worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the whole city converts en masse, like as a huge social shift in the city. And some people have said, just like the fish thing, right? Just like the fish thing. They go, that never happened because where are the records in Assyrian documents? Okay, that's a good question. Y'all with me? Here's the problem. If you're going to ask what about a mass conversion in Nineveh, you also have to ask what about the reigns of Ashur-dan III and Ashur-Nirari V from 772 to 745 BC. Now I know most of you, like on a bus or on a plane or a train, you're ready with that information, right? You're like, yeah, but what about Ashur-dan III? You know, that's my guy. You got the trading cards? I'll trade you an Ashur-dan III for an Ashur-Nirari V, right? You got the trading card set. So I get it. That's not really on the tip of most of our tongues, but here's why it matters. If you want to talk about Assyrian history, the reign of those two kings from 772 to 745 BC, mid-8th century, was marked by huge social upheaval. The Assyrian Empire was still an empire in name only. They were falling to pieces. And so there was a much greater amount of autonomy between cities, and it was almost like a league of city-states that would band together for defense, but they had nothing to do with each other in internal affairs. Records are spotty. They weren't kept well. The government was in absolute chaos in the mid-8th century. Are y'all with me? Think of like huge social upheaval in the United States, okay? The difference is we were still keeping really copious records. But there are plenty of stories of things that happened, and even say a time of great crisis like the Civil War, that you never hear of, and that's why they can still make movies about it, because you haven't heard about this little, speck of history. I think of something as simple as the Free State of Jones down in Mississippi. Most of y'all growing up in other parts of the country, you didn't know that there were counties that rebelled against the Confederacy in the middle of the Civil War and tried to create a free state. So the states were seceding. There were counties that were trying to secede again from their state. So you don't know that history, but it's true. And then that's why Matthew McConaughey can come along and make a movie about it. You know what I mean? Because you didn't know that that was a thing. Nineveh would have been able to go through a mass conversion, and it could have been a local decision by local government authorities that had nothing to do with the rest of the Assyrian Empire. Are y'all with me? And again, Jesus took it to be a fact. Why? Because he said that the residents of Nineveh will raise up at the last day of the resurrection and give testimony against many of the Jews of Jesus' own day, because all they had was Jonah preaching to them, and he says, and they converted. But y'all didn't, and you had me, and I'm greater than Jonah. Right? Not only that, but the descendants of the Assyrians, many of whom are Christian today, are still around. So it's not just that they converted in the moment. Many of their descendants, when they heard the gospel for the first time, went back and then converted and followed Christ. And I can show you an example of this guy singing one of these weeks if you're just really into Aramaic language and what it sounds like. If you want to hear what Jesus' language sounded like from some guy who still speaks it as his native language, I can show you that. It's really cool. Okay? I mean, it's nerdy cool, but it's cool, right? You can put an asterisk on it if you want to. I just call it cool. It's kind of like in Switzerland, they just call it a knife. No, no one? Or just cheese? If you're a native nerd, you just call it cool. You don't have to call it nerdy cool. Anyway, and then some people say, well, what about the claim that Nineveh was a 3-day journey? So you'll see as we go through the text says that Jonah went to Nineveh, which was a great city that took 3 days to walk across it. It was a 3-day journey. And people say, no city in the ancient Near East at that time was that big. There's no way that this is true, that it takes you 3 days to walk across it. Well, here's the problem, guys. It says Nineveh, the great city. They don't have a word in their language, like from Greek, like the metroplex of Dallas-Fort Worth. Like they don't say things like the metroplex. They don't say Metro Atlanta. They said Nineveh, the great city. And Nineveh was actually a triangle of 3 cities. Think of like the Research Triangle out in Carolina, okay? I know y'all don't know your Southern geography, but, or the Twin Cities, like up in Minnesota or something like that. Or again, the metroplex of Dallas-Fort Worth. Nineveh was actually a triangle of 3 cities. So they can mean Nineveh, the district, Nineveh, the region, Metro Nineveh. That could have taken you 3 days to walk across it because it's a triangle of 3 cities. Everybody with me? So when people try to make this not fact, they don't typically have real good ground to stand on, because everything that the text of Jonah says actually correlates with something. Like it's not that hard to correlate it, okay? Another way that this book is different from other books of the prophets is that Jonah employs satire and irony. You can get this in the other prophets, but it's not as often. Why? Well, good. I'm glad you asked. I'm going to tell you why. Because for one, Middle Eastern culture, even today, doesn't employ a whole lot of sarcasm. Sarcasm is considered extremely rude. And in their culture, being rude is like really, like you can't be rude, okay? Even if you hate someone and you plan on killing them later, you'll probably feed them first, okay? Because that's their culture. You have to practice hospitality. And I know these things are hard for us because we don't share that culture, but that's why I'm trying to alert us to it. So for one, in their culture, you don't practice a lot of sarcasm. And so satire and irony is also not as often used. Whereas in Irish literature, it's used all the time because no one's more smart aleck than the Irish, right? I mean, are you with me? It's a culture thing. Yeah, do we have a question or comment?
I was just gonna say, I saw it was a Middle Eastern guy talking about hospitality.
Right.
And he said if somebody shows up at his house, they have to house them and feed them for, I think it was 3 days before they ask, why are you here?
Yes. Yeah, so see, the culture is just really, really different, y'all, okay? And sometimes we take that stuff to be religious, but most of that stuff, like the hospitality stuff, that predates Islam. Okay, that got sucked into Islam, but that was already their culture before they started following Islam. Okay. But this book does use both satire and irony. So to remind you, if it's been a hot minute since you've been in a literature class or something in school, satire focuses the reader or hearer on the absurdities and deformities in society with which we've all become far too comfortable. So that's the purpose of satire, okay? And irony, of course, is a figure of speech in which either the intended meaning or an event means the opposite of that which is stated or expected. So Jonah is a book of prophecy that will deliver a satiric tone through the use of irony. Everybody with me? So just the fact, so back to Joel's comment about the prophet's life, right? So back to Joel's comment about the prophet's life. The fact that God tells the prophet to go to Nineveh and then he goes in the exact opposite direction is irony. Why? Because whenever there's a prophet in the Old Testament and God says, hey, do this, what does every prophet say? Yeah, here I am, send me, or okay, or they start going or whatever. They don't say no. Jonah is an example of a prophet who's like, it's not a good idea, I'm not doing it. And not only does he not go, he goes in the exact opposite direction. Okay, to Tarsus, yeah. So he's headed to Tarsus, which is in the exact opposite direction. So that's irony in this book. Are y'all with me? So we're going to see that over and over and over as we go through the text of the prophet Jonah. The purpose of the satirical tone delivered through the use of dramatic irony is didactic. It means, in other words, there's a teaching purpose. So the way we're going to take this text, y'all, is that this is a true story that the writer wants us to learn something from. But again, the fact that you can tell when you're reading through Jonah that you are probably supposed to be getting like a moral to the story, like there's supposed to be a point I'm getting, is why some people today take it as a parable. Because a parable is a made-up story that's meant to teach a point. This happens to be a true story that's told a certain way in order to teach a point. Everybody with me? Does that make sense where you get your mail delivered? Okay. Yeah, we got a question or comment.
Okay, so just thinking about what you've been explaining, why would somebody in that culture write this style of literature at a time when it's not popular?
Well, saying that this style of literature may not be popular, we don't know. We don't know that it wasn't popular because this time period, mid-8th century, is a funky time. It was a lot of upheaval, and there was a lot of upheaval for the Jewish people because of exile, etc. Okay, because after the Assyrians is going to come Babylon. So. But what we can say is that whoever wrote Jonah down, whether that's Jonah or somebody else about Jonah, okay, we're not actually sure who the author is. But whoever wrote Jonah down, first of all, this has been a masterwork of literature because people keep looking at it over and over and over again and it won't go away. And number two, this is not a book that's a theological lightweight. It's short, whereas like a book like Isaiah is like 66 chapters or whatever. This is not a theological lightweight. This is a short book that packs a huge theological punch because of the way it was written and because of the points it's trying to make. And so we can only assume that the writer came up with a really good idea to try to prove a point and wrote it down that way, and it's stuck with us all these years. It's just really good writing. Yeah, great question. Other questions, problems, comments? This book is not about a fish, said the guy who put a picture up there of a guy and a fish. Mostly because if you ask St. Google Jonah, it gives you a bunch of fish, right? Because like that's The fish, y'all, only comes up like in 2 verses, okay? Like, this is not a story about a fish. This is a story about a prophet named Jonah. This is not a story about a fish. And yet, that's what sticks with people, is the part about the fish, okay? So I'll have a lot of pictures of a fish, because then I have to get my pictures off of Google. But it's not about a fish. It's about a prophet. And it's told a certain way to prove a point. But, okay, I just want to make sure this is clear outside everybody's head, or outside of my own head, excuse me, for everybody else. I'm going to teach this book like it's a narrative history about a real prophet, and it is a book of prophecy, and yet it's different from other books of prophecy. That's how I'm going to run it. Okay, everybody with me? Next week, though, we're going to make a connection that you may not have expected. Because I'm going to show you how the narrative of Jonah's life has real significant connections to the narrative of Noah's life. And many of y'all may not have thought through those connections yet. Because you probably, in your mind, you might keep the story of Noah as one thing and the story of Jonah as another thing, but there are similarities in the narrative of these 2 men's lives. So maybe I'll give you something that you couldn't get from VeggieTales, which is a huge goal of mine. Yes.
Well, some cases, Jonah was bad luck. What is that all?
Well, we'll talk about the superstition of the sailors. But Harlan, the sailors that Jonah is sailing with are sailors. It's kind of like baseball fans. They're superstitious, Harlan, is what I'm trying to tell you. Okay? If any of y'all ever have known sailors, they're superstitious, just like baseball fans. Yeah.
Yes, I was going to ask with Jonah, he's dove. Does that have something to do with the ark?
I'm not spoiling it. And you're trying awfully hard, and you're going to get an A for effort. But I'm not spoiling it for you. We're going to talk about it next week. I'm trying to hook you so that you come back. All right, and you don't have to be sorry. I'm just not going to tell you. Until next week, because I'm trying to hook you. I'm trying to get you to come back to the same bad channel, okay? Same bad time, same bad channel. All right, we're a little early today. Sometimes we're a little late. Today we're a little early. I love you. Jesus loves you. Go away. I'll see some of you in service, and I'll see all of y'all for the study next week. Bye.